This is the People Who Read People podcast with me, Zach Elwood. This is a podcast aimed at better understanding other people and better understanding ourselves. You can learn more about it at behavior-podcast.com. This show sometimes focuses on political polarization and conflict. I see our tendency to get involved in toxic conflict as humanity's main problem, while also being a problem that's barely discussed, at least barely discussed in a meaningful, helpful way. That's why I've written a couple books on the topic of American polarization. I have an ebook written for all Americans titled Diffusing American Anger. You can learn more about my work on this topic and see reviews at my site, american-anger.com. In America, we've heard a lot of people talking about democracy and threats to democracy and undemocratic behaviors. This language is mostly associated with concerns about and criticisms of Trump and Republicans, but it's also true that many Trump-voting, Trump-supporting people see Democrats and liberals as the undemocratic ones. As is true in many toxic conflicts, both sides will see the other side as the ones behaving in the most underhanded and unfair ways. Seeing that this is just a basic aspect of toxic conflict doesn't require you to think both sides are equally right. We're talking here about perceptions, how we filter the large and complex environment around us to build our narratives. Perceptions are important. What's been interesting to me is that people on both sides who see their opponents as behaving undemocratically are often speaking about entirely different categories of behavior. There can be entirely different perceptions and definitions of what democracy is and what is undemocratic. The ambiguity of these terms lend themselves to very different interpretations. The ambiguity of these terms makes it so that just about anything can be labeled as undemocratic depending on how you define democracy. So that's why I wanted to talk to Elizabeth Dahl, my guest. She's someone who has been working on reducing toxic polarization for a while. She has volunteered with the organization Braver Angels for several years. Since 2022, her title with them is Director of Braver Politics. She's a Republican-leaning voter and activist who voted for Trump in 2020, but not in 2024. She's also someone who has expressed frustration with what she sees as often hypocritical behaviors from liberal and anti-Trump people. Some people who claim to want to save and maintain democracy are, in her view, promoting undemocratic ideas. For example, efforts to get rid of the Electoral College or stack the Supreme Court, or attempts to unfairly smear conservative associated stances and remove them from the public square, things like this. So I wanted to ask her about her views, what specifically was bothering her or has been bothering her. What specifically does she see as undemocratic on the Democrat/liberal side? How do her views in these areas differ from other people's views? I think anyone who wants to reduce toxic polarization and anyone who is concerned about democracy, however they define that, or anyone who just wants to be a more persuasive, effective activist, I think all these people should want to understand these different views of democracy and undemocratic and how people are using these terms. Without curiosity about these different views and interpretations, we're at risk of always speaking past each other, of just yelling at each other, "You're undemocratic," "No, you are," without really understanding why we're upset with each other and why we're misunderstanding each other. Some people watching this might be thinking, why are you focused on this intellectual conflict resolution stuff? Obviously, Trump is doing harm to the country right now. Obviously, he himself is undemocratic. Isn't all this talk rather removed and distant from real world problems? I'd say the reason that anti-Trump people should want to care about this topic is that you should want to understand why smart and rational and compassionate Americans supported Trump and voted for him. You should want to understand what leads to that support and what continues to lead people to not caring about the things that you care about. Because in a polarized dynamic like ours, support for a specific leader is less about liking their qualities and ideas and much more about concerns and anger at the perceived threats and insults on the other side. To understand Trump's appeal, you must understand why people see their liberal opponents as behaving badly and unfairly, as being undemocratic in various ways. You should be curious to understand why people can come to see Democrats as the bad guys. You should be curious to know what bothers people like my guest. It doesn't matter if you agree with my guest's points or not. It's important to understand people's perceptions and concerns and fears. If your reaction is just something like, but Trump is clearly horrible, enough with the empathy for Trump voters and their views. If you can't see why Trump is horrible, you're a lost cause, these types of reactions, then I would say you're behaving in ways that are similar to Trump voters who take similar approaches, who think the time for understanding each other is past, we just need to fight them harder. There's always an excuse for giving up on understanding each other, for justifying not caring about our adversaries' narratives and concerns. That desire to write them off and say, fuck their views, is how our conflict continues to grow worse. It is what leads to support for more polarizing, more extreme, more hostile leaders and activists. And it is, in the end, self-defeating for the people that use those approaches. For Trump-opposed people who are skeptical about this, you might like a recent op-ed I got in The Hill titled, "Can We Lower Toxic Polarization While Still Opposing Trump?" You might like checking that out, or maybe you'd like to check out my book, How Contempt Destroys Democracy, which is about similar topics. It's also important to recognize that we've become polarized around the word democracy, just as we've become polarized over many words and phrases. That's for a few reasons. For one, Democrat side messaging about, quote, saving democracy can create a natural Republican side inclination to try to downplay and even mock such concerns. This results in a team-based instinct to make, in my opinion, rather childish arguments like, well, actually, we're a republic, not a democracy. Even as clearly we are both a democracy and a republic, we're a democratic republic with a representative democracy. Some of our polarization over language has this kind of flavor to it. People see their opponents using language, and so we begin to be polarized over words and phrases. So much about conflict is self-reinforcing. Another likely factor in our polarization over the word is the name of the Democratic Party. You can see this being a factor in the way that some Republicans refer to it as the Democrat Party instead of the Democratic Party, as sort of a way to insult them and say that they're not really democratic. But still, even with our polarization over the word democracy, you'll find many Republican pro-Trump supporters, expressing support for democratic values in surveys and criticizing Democrats for being, quote, undemocratic. Political groups are never monoliths. They contain a spectrum of partisan hostility and different aspects of polarization. Often similar views and concerns on both sides or in the same side will manifest with very different language. This polarization happens for a lot of words and phrases. I previously interviewed Isaac Saul, the creator of Tangle News, about the role of journalism and news in either amplifying our divides or reducing them. We talked a good amount about language in that. And related to this topic of language, Isaac has an interesting TED Talk titled 3 Ideas for Communicating Across the Political Divide. In that talk, he explores how subtle word choices can inhibit productive dialogue about significant issues and shows how small but important changes can help us all have better conversations with people who think differently than us. To anyone who cares about reducing divides or just more effective communication or activism, language is key to all of these things. More about my guest, taken from the Braver Angels site. Elizabeth Dahl joined Braver Angels in March 2022 as the director of Braver Politics after 4 years of volunteering with the organization and many years working in politics in the Pacific Northwest. She began political work as a teen when, while interning on a congressional campaign, she became passionate about improving her community through civic engagement. Since then, Elizabeth has consulted for and worked on many state and local campaigns. I have a Substack entry that I wrote based on this talk. It's titled Ambiguity in Democracy-Related Language and the Ease with Which We Can Call Disliked Stances Undemocratic. It attempts to summarize my learnings and thoughts after talking to Elizabeth. I saw 3 different main ways that people were defining democracy, and those different ways led to different takes on what they viewed as undemocratic. Okay, here's the talk with Elizabeth. Hi, Elizabeth. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me. Happy to be here.
So maybe we could start with what drew you to the work of wanting to work on reducing political toxicity and the polarization problem.
Yeah, absolutely. I was working in politics. I started doing that very early on. I was a teenager for my first congressional campaign. And I started to see people, even in local politics, breaking relationships with each other, whether they were in the same party and just disagreed over tactics, but nonetheless saw each other as political enemies, or whether they were in opposing parties and it was families no longer talking to each other, friends no longer talking to each other. I started to get really concerned being in more of a rural community that we wouldn't be able to meet each other's needs if anything happened because we wouldn't know each other. We wouldn't know what each other's needs were if people weren't talking to each other. I'm the type of person that once I notice a problem, then I have to figure out if there's anything that I can do about it. And if there is something that I can do about it, then I try to do those things. So it was sort of a natural next step for me to start thinking about what I had seen. What was that called? Oh, it's called polarization. Okay, well, can I do something about it? And I spent a lot of, not a lot, but I spent a few years noodling what, if anything, I could do about it, and eventually ended up organizing dinners between Republican and Democratic women. Um, and a friend of someone who attended one of those dinners invited me to this thing in the town next to mine called a Red Blue Workshop that was put on by what was then Better Angels. I had my first ever experience and said, "Oh my gosh, this is what I was trying to invent.
Mm.
And there's
Hmm.
already national infrastructure. I'll be a spoke in this wheel."
Hmm.
And promptly plugged myself in. That was spring of 2018. We're now in 2025. So it's been a fair few years that I have been thinking almost single mindedly about the problem of political polarization and how to mitigate it.
Hmm. Yeah, you've been in this early on, relatively speaking, for the polarization work. Yeah. So, would you care to share, because we'll be talking about Trump and reactions to him, would you care to talk about your support of Trump and how that's changed over the years, and maybe some of your voting preferences?
Yeah, so I am very much an ideological conservative. In 2016, I took the Ben Shapiro tack. I was very much never Trump, by which I didn't necessarily mean never ever in any election. I just meant never Trump for the 2016 election. But nonetheless, my concern was that Trump was not actually conservative. And moreover, I wasn't entirely certain that he would even be more conservative than Hillary Clinton. And so I did not vote for him. I voted for Evan McMullin, who was a write in candidate. Um, yeah, he was a write in candidate from Utah. Uh, he sort of went a little bit off what I think is the deep end after that, unfortunately, and became extremely single mindedly anti Trump. But at the time, he seemed like a particularly excellent candidate in the tradition, in the long tradition of ideological conservatives before. Um, in 2020, I ate my humble pie. Uh, Trump, in fact, had governed much more conservatively than Hillary Clinton would have. And he appointed two Supreme Court justices um, who I really, really liked and stood by Brett Kavanaugh even through the whole drama of sexual assault allegations. And I think that probably any other president would have backed down and asked Brett Kavanaugh to step aside and nominated Amy Coney Barrett instead. Um, I'm glad that we ended up getting both ACB and Brett Kavanaugh. And I think in hindsight, none of the allegations against Brett Kavanaugh held any water. Um, I appreciated the term from 2016 to 2020. I thought it was pretty good. And then January 6th of 2021, I promptly regretted having voted for Trump in 2020. I think that it, in fact, was a constitutional crisis that Mike Pence, rather than Donald Trump, had to call in the National Guard in DC. I think that it is a constitutional crisis that Donald Trump asked Mike Pence to find a way to overturn the electors. Those are not things that I want from any president at any time from any party. And that was sort of the straw that broke the camel's back for me on Trump. And after a lot of the election denial stuff in 2020 also really frustrated me. Um, and I could not bring myself to vote for him in 2024. I feel really, really good about that choice.
Gotcha. Yeah. So that's just a. I know. I wanted to ask that. I know. When I have these talks, it's top of people's minds, whether it should be or not. Is going through those kinds of things. So yes, maybe the reason I wanted to have this talk is because the nature of our divides is such that many people on both sides, leaving aside who's more correct or whose fears are more justified, we know that studies show that many people on both, quote, sides view the other side as behaving undemocratically and engaging in undemocratic and really unfair ways in various ways. But I think also the nature of our divide is that it can be really hard for people on both sides to understand the other side's narratives. So, for example, I think there's a lot of Democrat-leaning citizens who would have a hard time understanding that point of view on the right about, they would say, well, what exactly, they would wonder what exactly are people concerned about when they say, Democrats or liberals are behaving undemocratically. So I'm curious, would you like to go through maybe some of the things that maybe we could start with some of the things that are top of mind that you see as top of mind on the Republican side for those things, and then maybe we can talk about your views a little bit after that. But maybe you could talk about what's top of mind on the pro-Trump / Republican side for Democrats behaving undemocratically.
Yeah, absolutely. So, top of mind for me right now in terms of Republicans behaving undemocratically is the deportations to El Salvador.
Oh,
Um,
and sorry, you said Republicans, but I was thinking I was actually asking about what Republicans view
oh,
Democrats
the
doing
Republican perspective on
on
Democratic
Democrats. Yeah, and we
being.
can we can get into the Republican side things, but
Yeah, sorry. I thought you were
yeah,
asking me to
sorry,
start with my opinions on Republicans and then move
yeah,
on to the Democratic
sorry.
side.
It's hard to throw in all these terms. I know it can get a little muddled. So, but
Too many
yeah,
different, too many uppercase and
categories.
lowercase uses of the word Republican and Democrats.
Yeah, yeah. But my main focus was going to be, yeah, what's in Republicans' minds when they're saying Democrats have been behaving undemocratically. Yeah.
Yeah, usually top of mind for most Republicans are the SCOTUS reforms and the anti-electoral college push. Both of those things are regularly talked about by leaders on the left, whether it is Chuck Schumer or ProPublica, or Nancy Pelosi, um, or AOC. There is a consistent push, usually admittedly from the progressive left, more than the liberal left, but certainly still some comes from liberal left congressional reps as well, and senators, to pack the Supreme Court, to expand the Supreme Court, to create a retirement status that would only impact Clarence Thomas's ability to be an active participant on the Supreme Court. Breathless reports sharing that conservative justices have really not violated any ethics rules, but doesn't it feel like a conflict of interest that conservative justices are friends with influential conservatives? No mention of the close relationships between progressive justices and the amicus briefs that come in.
Mhm.
No mention of the relationships between the progressive attorneys uh, testifying, for example, Chase Strangio and his connection to the Democrats on the court. It's only a conflict of interest when it's someone whose politics they don't like.
Mhm.
They only want to pack the Supreme Court when they think the Supreme Court is deciding in a way that they disagree with. They only want to expand the court because they want to change the outcomes from the court.
Mhm. Mhm.
That's politics. That is undermining a constitutional institution, an enumerated constitutional institution, one of the most important pieces of our federal government to ensure protection of individual rights and to protect us from an authoritarian president. And they would like often when it rules in a way that is different than they would like to completely change it, to allow it to be altered for their political ends. And that is the exact opposite of the purpose of the Supreme Court. It is, while it is small d democratic in the technical sense, I think that one big thing that is missed is when the American people think about democracy, they're not just thinking about the technical small d democratic sense of a mass of people voting majority vote only for things. Instead, they're thinking about the American system that is outlined in the Constitution. That's what most people mean when they say democracy. And I find there's a bit of a Mott and Bailey on the left sometimes, particularly in the quote unquote pro democratic groups, where they pretend that they're talking about the mott of our system of government built, established on the Constitution and supported by the founders. And then they switch to the Bailey in specific policy arguments of small d democracy and one voice equal one person equals one vote in every circumstance, and majority rule is the best thing that we could have.
Mhm.
I find that to be incredibly deceptive. I find that to be incredibly undermining toward our institutions, incredibly undermining of the Constitution, and really not much different than the anti democratic actions of the rioters on January 6th.
Mm.
They both wanted to overturn constitutional provisions, but one of them wants to overturn a constitutional provision to help progressives, and the other wanted to overturn a constitutional provision to help Trump.
Yeah, I mean, I do often in my book, Diffusing American Anger, I talked about the different interpretations of democratic or democracy. You know, there's all, as you're getting at, there's different ways people can use that, which I think gets at the fundamental way we can be arguing it. You know, people can be arguing at different angles on those things and completely be missing, understanding what their opponents are talking about. Because yeah, there's this, what you're referring to as small d democracy, is this idea that, you know, the conceptual idea that we should hear or from many people, and many people should be involved, or you know that many people should be respected, many groups should be respected, all these kinds of more conceptual ideas. But then there's, you know, the idea that people are using democracy to refer to these specific rules that we have that, you know, are in the Constitution. So there's these different ways people are coming at the argument depending on, and I see a lot of team based thinking in it, right? It's like, because you can justify, depending on how you parse that language, you can kind of justify any kind of team based thing you want to justify depending on how you interpret, you know, like, oh, if you think Republicans are doing something unfair, you can label that as undemocratic, right? Pretty much no matter what it is, and kind of, you know, vice versa for any team based thing. So I think the ambiguity in the language there, which I think gets into a lot of ambiguity for a lot of these contentious issues about the language we use, because people can be using so many different terms in so many ways. But I'm curious if you have anything to add on that ambiguity and that of the democracy language.
Just that I find it incredibly frustrating as a conservative when I talk to progressives about the who are panicking about the anti-democratic actions on the right. And I ask them, well, do you support the Electoral College? Like, well, no, we think that there should be this National Popular Vote Compact. Okay, well, the National Popular Vote Compact is an end run around the Constitution. It is an attempt to avoid the necessity of a constitutional amendment for an enumerated constitutional process. You are also undermining the Constitution. Explain to me why you are so concerned about the anti democratic actions on the right, and you haven't even noticed your own support for anti constitutional actions. Because even most progressives, are not thinking about the conflict between having a republic with democratic leanings or a constitutional republic, whatever word you want to use for that, versus having a direct democracy. And it's difficult because, on one hand, yes, I am absolutely advocating for the support and continued uh, continued existence and strength of undemocratic institutions. But undemocratic institutions are the point in our Constitution. It's why Benjamin Franklin said, a republic, if you can keep it. This is the way that our government was intended to be. And if you say that anti democratic actions are those that are trying to tear down the system of constitutional governance that we have, I have questions when you are only upset about the right and not at all upset about things happening on the left. It drives me up a wall when I hear people advocate to get rid of the Electoral College via a state compact that is quite literally trying to avoid the legal mandate of a constitutional amendment and try to undermine the Second Amendment and try to undermine the First Amendment, the freedom of speech, but they're concerned about my side of the aisle being anti-democratic. Like, let's talk.
Yeah, well, I think there's a couple of things in there that I think about where it's like, regardless of whether you like it or not, it always perplexes me when people talk about it as if it's something that we should easily get rid of or can easily get rid of, because whether you like the electoral college or not, it is part of the system of American government. It was embedded in the system. So yeah, the idea, and then the other thing that strikes me is getting back to the team-based interpretations, because I think we know that if the shoe was on the other foot, we'd see many people making the opposite arguments, right? A lot of the arguments that we make on these things is depending on, like, how, power, basically, like who has the power. So if the shoe was on the other foot, you'd see Republicans arguing for the popular vote, and you'd see Democrats arguing um, for the electoral college. Um, but yeah, I think I think it gets, the thing that bugs me about liberal side arguments on that is not understanding what's bothering you and other people in terms of trying to act like these things should or could easily be gotten rid of, and not really grappling with the fact that these are part of the system of government, whether you like it or not, and you have to take that seriously, and think about that seriously, and not just try to, like you're saying, create an end run around it, right? And then yeah, B is acting as if any of these things are obvious, because like getting to the affective polarization of treating people with contempt who disagree. I see a lot of that too, where it's like, you know, acting as if you're an idiot for thinking the electoral college is a good thing, or these kinds of things. Getting to the contempt that people will treat people who disagree with them. That's another thing I see in that area.
Yeah, I'm going to push back just for a second here on the notion that if the shoe were on the other foot, you would see the same behavior from Republicans opposing the anti-democratic institutions. I think that that hasn't been true for a long time, but you are starting to see that now in the political realignment. I think that the Democratic Party, for a lot of decades at this point, basically, I think since William F. Buckley kicked the Birchers out of the Republican Party, um, you have seen the Democratic Party increasingly become a grievance constituency that is more reactive than ideological in any way. And the Republican Party was deeply ideological in almost all of its senses, more than a grievance constituency. I would argue, even really until 2016. I would argue that you started to see some of that in 2010, really with the Tea Party movement, even though I was a part of that movement. And a lot of really wonderful people joined the party and are ideologically conservative as a result of the Tea Party movement. Um, I think that there was also a lot of grievance built into some of the people who joined the Tea Party movement, the uprising, the populist movement. And now I think it's much more fully fleshed out. The Republican Party's transition into a grievance party that mirrors the Democrats. But I think for many, many decades, you had a party that, for example, the whole Federalist Society was built in response to the Progressive Burger Court. And it wasn't built on an idea that the Republican Party would have its own expansive definition. That hasn't happened until now with the advent of common good, so-called common good constitutionalism. Instead, it was built on the idea that we would have the most historically accurate interpretation of the Constitution that was possible. That we would treat the Constitution as a dead letter that could be known according to original public meaning at the time, rather than a living Constitution that fit our will. And so I do want to push back on that conception just a little bit, that um, it has always been a team based sport,
Oh yeah,
because I think it is
definitely not
much.
always. Yeah, it's become more team based, is what I mean. And especially in the past, 10 years, but even like with all the partisan hostility ramping up over the last 15, 20. That's what I was mainly referring to. Is you probably agree with me that we see more people on both sides, regardless of who we think is more wrong or right or more right. I think you'd probably agree that we see more people filtering things through, justifying things through a team based lens of like, okay, if my side, if it helps my side, I'll be more okay with it. But yeah, I feel like
100%.
that's
Yeah,
definitely gotten
absolutely.
worse in the as time has gone on. Yeah, yeah. Um,
Um,
so do you want to? Yeah, that okay. So we talked about the electoral college, the SCOTUS reforms. What other big things on your mind there? Well, one thing I did want to preface it with is I think there's two when it comes to things that bother Republicans or bother anyone really about the undemocratic actions. You could kind of group them into the ways that people treat their opponents. For example, Democrats reaching for ultra pessimistic views of Republicans and what motivates them. That's a whole class of how we speak and treat about our opponents, which can be viewed as undemocratic and insulting. Treating people as if their concerns are not relevant or not rational, right? That's a whole class of things you could fit into that large category, apart from the thing actual behaviors like trying to restrict Trump from being on the ballot, like actual actions that are taking. So it might be helpful to think about it in terms of the kind of insulting views or framings of opponents versus the actions. But I don't know if you want to talk about other things that are top of mind for undemocratic actions, though, for you.
Yeah, so you told me you wanted to hear it all. So you see, I
Yeah,
have a lot of bullet points on my
sure,
list.
yeah. Go
Um,
ahead.
so I can to talk about what you were mentioning. The racial resentment scale is something that has frustrated me more as I have become someone engaged in depolarization and really dived into the peer-reviewed academic literature around political polarization. When I was a young Republican conservative, uh, I was always hearing people call Republicans racist. And I just sort of thought this was a stereotype. I didn't know it was based in anything. I had never seen racism. Um, it wasn't until I'd heard myths about like the Southern strategy and Republicans appealed to racist Southern Democrats to win the South. Well, the South didn't actually fully flip to Republicans until the aughts. So if they had a Southern strategy to win racists as a that being the primary point of a campaign, like that was a pretty significant failure. Um, and it didn't start in the places that you would most expect to have uh, serious problems with racism. Um, Instead, it was sort of a mobility change, and it was upwardly mobile middle class people who started to trend positively toward the Republican economic view. Um, and Democrats held the South for a very, very, very long time, and continue to hold major cities in the South continually. Like, has not been interrupted by Republicans since since Reconstruction. So that was something that I grew up sort of hearing like, okay, well, this is one motivation. But then I started diving into academic literature and polarization, and the racial resentment scale is everywhere. And it seems to underlie almost every major study's conclusion that Republicans are racist, that this is how Republicans have come to be popular. This is why we're so polarized. One of the bullet points in almost every academic piece about polarization on the right says the right is more polarized than the left because they appeal to racial resentment. I'm
Yeah, that was
going
the
to read
main,
you.
and that was the main thesis, basically, in Ezra Klein's book, which is super popular, the Why We're Polarized book. It plays a role in so many of the, liberal leaning conceptions of, what polarization in America is about. Yeah.
I argue that the racial resentment scale is truly begging the question on whether you believe in a conservative frame on human nature or a more liberal frame on human nature. That is, that human nature is more self interested or human nature is basically good and other interested. So I'm going to read the statements on the racial resentment scale. Irish, Italian, and Jewish ethnicities overcame prejudice and worked their way up. Blacks should do the same without any special favors. Generations of slavery and discrimination have created conditions that make it difficult for blacks to work their way out of the lower class. Over the past few years, blacks have gotten less than they deserve. It's really a matter of some people just not trying hard enough. If blacks would only try harder, they could be just as well off as whites. And then sometimes they add two further statements in a later expanded version. I think this expanded in the 1970s. I want to say 76, but I might be off by a year or two. Government officials usually pay less attention to a request or complaint from a black person than from a white person. And most blacks who receive money from welfare programs could get along without it if they tried. I would argue that those first four questions, especially, but even the last two, also really, it's just asking the question, do you believe that government is helpful to improving people's circumstances?
Mhm.
And if you're a Republican, if you're a conservative ideologically, and you do not believe that government actually helps people improve their circumstances and that giving people special favors makes them worse off instead of better off, of course you believe that blacks should do the same without any special favors. If you believe in equal rights, in equal treatment under the law, of course you believe that blacks should do the same without any special favors. Generations of slavery and discrimination have created conditions that make it difficult for blacks to work their way out of the lower class. You're in the 1970s and you're being asked about slavery, especially as we get further into the data. If you're in the 2010s and you're being asked if you think that slavery and discrimination have created conditions that make it difficult for blacks to work their way out of the lower class, you're just being asked about how, to what degree you believe systemic racism plays a role in individual outcomes. And that's not a question of whether you believe that one group of people is less capable than another group of people based on their ethnicity. It's a question about whether you believe the role of government or society has substantially impacted and continues to substantially impact the ability of certain racial groups to get ahead. You that changes with politics, and it's not about a belief in one race's superiority over another race. It's about a different conception of individual versus collective guilt, about whether government help is effective or hurtful, about how much an individual's view of themselves as a victim versus empowered can change individual outcomes, and about your beliefs about individual outcomes. It's just a really, really horrific scale to measure whether or not someone is racist. You're
Yeah.
basically just asking whether or not someone agrees with conservative ideology and calling it racism.
And I'll throw in, and for people listening to this, I'll include in the entry for this episode on my site at behavior-podcast.com, I'll include resources related to this because, yeah, I've done in my book, Diffusing American Anger, I have a long section about this, exactly what you're talking about. And, there's academics who examine this, like Musa Al-Gharbi. I don't know if you read his paper, Race and the Race for the White House. He does a great examination in this paper about the bias in these areas from, liberal academics who basically are describing conservative views as racist, basically exactly what you're saying. And I think that his paper is one of the more important ones for understanding how liberals and, slash Democrats have contributed to toxicity. I think that's very important for people to understand, and to understand how upsetting that is for conservatives to constantly be told they're racist, right? Like that is a very upsetting thing. And to understand the American divides, you have to be willing to understand why that's so upsetting and how that can be viewed as an ultimate kind of undemocratic smear campaign, right? Like, so yeah, just to say there's many things to say there, and I think it's very important to understand that aspect of our divides. Yeah.
And also, incredibly frustrating to me now is that it has opened the Overton window incredibly wide to allow actual racists to sneak into society, and to sneak into acceptability. Because it's not just Republicans that stopped considering racist to be a serious smear. Normal average Americans recognized that people were being smeared as racist who weren't, especially in 2020. It became totally unavoidable. Even the term white supremacist lost its power, lost its meaning. And now there are no superlatives left from which to expel, with which to expel people who have actually horrendous, condemnable views on race.
It's the
We
boy
have
who cried wolf kind of effect
It is
writ large.
100%
Yeah.
the boy who cried
For
wolf.
for lots of things, for authoritarian, for fascist, for undemocratic, all these kinds of labels. It's like I mean, it feels like so many of these things have been weakened, which I think helps explain, how these things unfold in conflict, where everyone just gets burnt out when you see so many labels like that thrown around, and then it becomes increasingly hard to distinguish what's going on and what actually is the bad things versus what's being overstated. Right? It just creates this extremely confusing environment where I read the paper and I constantly have to do my own work to determine is this a really bad thing or is it a standard thing that's being blown out of proportion, right? So yeah.
Yeah. And frankly, most people aren't doing that. Most people are not you and I when someone is called a white supremacist going to check, is this person actually a white supremacist, or is this person being accused of white supremacy because they violated a progressive taboo?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And you either get one side or the other. You get cancellation without cause, or you get acceptance without warrant. And neither of those is a good situation to be in. You want your words to have power. You want to be able to say that someone is very bad and have people take you seriously. You
Mm-hmm.
want to be able to say this person's views are abhorrent to a polite society and have people say, yes, that means something.
Yeah.
Because right now, we're in a world, I've been called white supremacist twice. Once by a ginger in a workshop because uh, we didn't we I wanted to stick to the schedule allotted for a particular exercise within the workshop. I've been called a white supremacist because I advocated for a group of parents to be allowed to reinstitute a policy that was in the public school in my district until 2020 that required the school district to notify parents when the school was going to be discussing a controversial issue.
Yeah. I think
Neither one of those things are white supremacy.
I've been called all sorts of names doing this work myself. Yeah. And I think some people listening to this might think like, oh, what are these kinds of negative, pessimistic views, even if they are bad? What does this have to do with undemocratic things? Liberal people who are thinking about things they view as undemocratic on the right or from Trump. But I think it's very important to understand how all of these things are related, right? Like ultra pessimistic treatment of our opponents can be viewed as undemocratic, as unfair, which can in turn lead to not caring about things that might be bad on your own side. So just to say, like
Yeah.
all of these things are related in the sense that
The other side is doing their worst. So why wouldn't we do our worst?
right, exactly, yeah, and it's like why should we care when you guys didn't care about how we were treated, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's very important to understand that's just how things get worse in a conflict in general. Yeah.
And further, like the abuse of extreme terms is directly related because you have terms like anti-Semitism, terms like authoritarianism, terms like fascism that mean something in a technical sense. And that should be scary to people. That should be a red flag or a flashing neon sign that say, you should be afraid and you should check yourself and you should be cautious about what you do from here. And those words no longer have meaning because they were used to describe things that they weren't. They were used to describe normal process that was a normal policy. It was just in disagreement with progressive monoliths. I'm sorry, progressive shibboleth. I was
Mm.
thinking monolithic thought and shibboleth at the same time, and what came out was not the right thing.
No, yeah, those I would get that confused too. Um, so yeah, okay. Do you want to? I know you had some other bullet points. Do you want to hit a few more? If we don't get to all of them, I can always add into
Yeah,
the
how much
episode.
time
But
do we have, actually? I guess
well,
I should have asked.
usually, yeah, we should have established that. But usually, I aim for about an hour. So maybe we could just hit a few, like spend a few sentences on your remaining ones, and maybe you can go in order of ones that jump out as the most upsetting.
Yeah. So let's say the obsession with Christian nationalism without an acknowledgement that progressives are actually more politically active than politically conservative Christians, or that many self described Christian nationalists and evangelicals, according to data from Ryan Burge, aren't even regular church attendees.
Yeah,
Lots of left wing authoritarianism exists. Nonetheless, until very recently, academics refused largely to even acknowledge that left wing authoritarianism was a thing, because authoritarianism is right wing government to its extreme on the political scale. And so you just can't have left wing authoritarianism. There's no such thing as left wing authoritarianism.
right, right. Which and both of those things you just mentioned, the ultra pessimistic things about Christian nationalism, which I also write about in my books about the overstatement of that and the worst case filtering for that, and the the liberal side, so-called liberal, so-called authoritarianism. Both of those things are related to the racism thing we just talked about, where these are all things related to like ultra pessimistic framings of worst case framings of what's driving the other side, and deducements about like what these surveys mean, taking the worst case framings of what these surveys mean and all these kinds of things. So yeah, carry on.
Yeah, just incredibly frustrating. This was especially frustrating during 2020 when I had state and federal government telling me whether I had to wear a mask and what circumstances I had to wear a mask, how many people I could have inside my own house at any one time, even though all of those people agreed of their own volition to come hang out together and understood the risk of COVID. Nope, the government needed to make those decisions for us. But that's not left wing authoritarianism, apparently. Just incredibly frustrating as someone conservative. All I want is an acknowledgement that there was, in fact, and continues to be, broad um, broad desire for left wing authoritarianism, whether it's over the economy, whether it's over people's lives in an emergency, what is considered to be an emergency situation, whether the government construes something as an emergency or not, and what they use that emergency to do. Kind of going all the way back to 2012 Hurricane Katrina. I'm sorry, 2005 Hurricane Katrina, where you have the government confiscating people's firearms, personal firearms that they are using for self defense in a lawless situation because it's allegedly an emergency. This sort of stuff is left wing authoritarianism, but it is not acknowledged as such. And it's incredibly frustrating to only ever hear about authoritarianism on the right and have it be completely ignored on the left. And not just ignored, but actively treated as though people who say it exists are making it up. A gaslighting of conservatives who complain about it.
Mhm.
Uh,
I think that's yeah. I think it's especially angering to people, the feeling that they're being gaslit, like that people aren't taking their concerns seriously. Because I think it'd be one thing if we had these disagreements and people talked about them, right, and talked about them in good faith. But I think getting to the whole toxic conflict thing, it's especially angering to
looks
people
like I
on
lost
both
you.
sides of a lot of these contentious issues, when they feel like the other side is just now listening to what their concerns are, and denigrating them and treating them like there's nothing to see there,
I
basically, right? I
can't hear
think
you
that
anymore.
that's what really takes it to this level
It
of
says the
like,
recording is
well,
being
screw you
saved
then if you're not
locally.
even going to like acknowledge my frustrations and my concerns and fears and such, right?
I hope you'll come back.
Oh, did we freeze up? Oh, I think we froze up. Oh, are you back, Elizabeth?
There we go.
Oh yeah, it froze up. I don't know where it froze up for you, but
Almost as soon as you started responding, it told me that
Oh,
you were
okay.
experiencing connectivity issues and it
Gotcha.
was being saved locally.
I think it got your response. So yeah, actually, I think I'll just leave off mine because I was just elaborating on your point. So okay, well maybe we can. Yeah, do you want to pivot back to your some of your more of your bullet points about undemocratic views concerns?
Yeah.
Oh, what about the effort to remove Trump from the ballot? What do you think of that, or what were your takes on that?
I was mildly annoyed by it, honestly. I was a lot less frustrated with it than a lot of my Republican friends were,
Hmm.
because it went through the correct channels.
Hmm.
People sued, it went to court, the courts followed the law, and correct determinations were made in a place of law that was really in question, as far as how this actually works. Is it self executing? Is it up to state governments? Is it up to the federal government? Is it um, something that local counties can decide? How is this enforced? Is it, can we actually stop people from voting for someone? Like lots and lots of actually interesting constitutional questions there, which is why I think you saw like even the Colorado court that is very blue completely split over what the right way forward was. And so, so long as we're actually following the process through the courts, I have no problem with challenging law. What I
Hmm.
have a problem with is ignoring law that exists in the first place,
Hmm.
um, and or openly and flagrantly violating it, and not even challenging it, just waiting for someone to enforce it
Hmm.
against you. If you think the law is bad, sue to change the law. And so it, because it went through the process, it honestly, it didn't bother me as much as it bothered other
Hmm.
Republicans.
I often hear on the right they'll say things about the Democratic Party, not calling them undemocratic because they didn't hold a primary for Harris and covered up Biden's decline, basically painting the Democratic Party as not really listening to the will of the people and such. I don't know if you want to talk about that kind of stuff. I'm a bit, I don't really understand it. Some of it seems like just objecting to some pretty standard things about how political parties operate. But I wonder if you want to talk a little bit about that view.
I mean, that's also basically my stance, because I have been very involved in party politics for half of my life at this point. Um, I I think it's ironic that the Democratic Party is too small or Republican to solve its internal problems. It has too much locus of control at the top, and um, too much king making, not enough small d democracy. And meanwhile, the Republican Party is too small d democratic to solve its internal schisms and become more representative of the American public. Um, I think that parties, though, get to set their own rules. So I don't think it is a bad thing per se, that Democrats have made their party non representative of the American people, just like I don't think it's a bad thing per se that the Republican Party has made its own rules, and they are non representative of the American people's views. Um, but I do think that both have resulted in bad outcomes, particularly for the Democrats in the 2024 election cycle, because they prioritized people, giving people power who have extraordinarily atypical political views. That's going to hurt your outcomes. But I do think also parties are motivated by winning elections. And so if you lose enough elections, eventually you change the way that you do things. I
Mm-hmm.
think that's sort of the reckoning that you see Democrats going through now. I think they didn't do this previously when Trump won because he didn't win the popular vote. And so it was really easy for them to just say, like, oh, he didn't actually win
Right.
Americans. He just won the electoral college and rural people, and it's different. But
They
when
treated it
he,
like an anomaly when they shouldn't have, basically. Yeah.
yes, and now that he won the national popular vote, even though it was really narrow, it's forced them to actually reckon with their non representative views.
Yeah, that's interesting to hear you talk about the party, the criticisms of the Democratic Party or parties in general, because I often hear people, denigrating the Democratic Party, or I hear people really angry at parties in general. And at some level, it just seems to me like to me, it feels like you're angry at the wrong things, because at some level, you're going to have parties, and the American system of government kind of pre-selects the system, just kind of like, for better or for worse, seems to have systematically produced this two-party outcome. And so at some level, you're going to have parties doing party things. So a lot of the anger I see around that is kind of like, these are just parties doing party things. Like, we can get angry at them and feel like they're doing things wrong, but at the end of the day, it's going to be imperfect no matter how you slice it. It's going to be jostling for power in various ways. So I feel like some of the things I see there are just kind of like not focused on, because I see in the polarization space, sometimes I'll see people say like, the entire problem is this two-party thing, and I'm like, is that really the problem? I don't think it's the problem. I think the problem is all this contempt we have for each other, right? Like, yeah.
I think it's the contempt. I think it's the lack of trust. But also, I do think that one of the problems with parties is not that we don't have enough of them. I think we actually have a lot of factions within the United States, depending on how you slice and dice, between 4 and 5 major factions in the American public among voters, but most of those are not actively engaged in the parties. And the entire idea of the party structure is that people would be actively engaged in selecting candidates through the parties. So I think when people are angry at the parties, they think of them as like evil machines that are trying to subvert the will of the people, rather than people run organizations who have particular desired ideological or reactionary outcomes. Um, and because only those few people are involved, you end up with bad political outcomes. We have the power to change this. All you have to do is get involved in the local party. It's genuinely not that difficult to change the balance of power at the county level. Um, it happens very regularly, but it is a thankless, tiring, obnoxious job, and people will be terrible to you. And so nobody wants to do it. It's much easier to point fingers than it is to get your hands dirty.
Yeah, and the anger I see some people express, the extreme anger I see some people express at like parties, or it strikes me as simplistic and similar to other extreme angers people express about like, it's all the rich people's fault, or it's all Republicans' fault, or it's all Democrats' fault. It's like there's all these simplistic framings of like casting blame, and it's like, this is a very complex system, and like, you're I think that's what strikes me about some of these things. Whenever I see somebody extremely angry and kind of burn it all down, I feel like they're just approaching the thing from like looking for a scapegoat for the dysfunction they see, and it's hard to easily find clean scapegoats. I feel like in such a complex system, because everything's related, right?
Yeah.
Uh, yeah.
Okay, so I'm sorry. I know it's already 11:02, and so we're
Oh, I'm
running out
okay
of
going over
time.
if you are. I mainly for your sake, I didn't want to draw it out too far. But if you want to go through a few more points, feel free.
Yeah, I'm okay. I don't have anything more on my calendar until this afternoon, so
Okay.
I've got some time.
Okay.
Um, but there are a couple of things in particular that I want to highlight here.
Sure.
I don't know if you want to get into talking about how people feel about the current administration at all, but kind of on the same track that we were going, I can want to talk about a specific experience that I had at Western Washington University because I finally found the video up and I think it's really emblematic of the anti constitutional left. So people tell me, like, oh, well, sometimes I'll hear people say, who are the leaders that are pushing this? Um, I don't I don't see who you mean, like who's saying that this is a good idea. And to my thinking, like it's not even all political leaders. It's a movement.
Right. It's a
And
cultural. It can be dispersed culturally. It doesn't necessarily require. I think that's the important to understand too. Is like some of the things that bother people. It doesn't require like major leaders expressing it. It can be like culturally dispersed, right?
yeah, so it's a couple of months ago, a guy presenting to 60 local Bainbridge Islanders who are fairly influential people about why the National Popular Vote Compact is a good thing and they should support it. I was at Western Washington University at a seminar on sustaining democracy last year in October, uh, and one of the two keynotes said, quote unquote, quote, I'm advocating that we should repeat the process that we got our current constitution by and say, let's ignore the current constitution. In response to me pushing him on whether he was concerned about a tyranny of the majority if we moved into more of a small d democratic government. He said, I don't see any way to construct any meaningful aspect of the people that inserts states into that, and that the sovereignty of states doesn't really fit into a democratic conception of government. The states after the first 13 are an arbitrary construction of Congress. States don't really have a place in democracy, in my opinion. And yes, I think we should subvert undemocratic institutions and improve them or replace those with democratic institutions. This is a guy who is a professor at University of Wisconsin-Madison, who is flown to Washington State, to Western Washington University, who is regularly instructing students in different places around the country about how democracy should best function. And he is telling them, he is teaching them in a dispersed way, not as a political leader, not as a guy with a super big name, that actually, yeah, the Constitution is bad, the US Senate is bad, even states really don't make any sense. And we should just have a direct democracy where the majority rule. And it's better for majority rule than minority rule because those are really the only two options that he sees.
Hmm.
Like
Hmm.
that
Right.
that is what I am concerned about.
Right. Right.
It's
Yeah.
not just Chuck Schumer complaining about the Supreme Court in a press conference. It's also every political science professor across the country telling their students that our American republic is bad.
Hmm.
The
Hmm.
way that the Constitution has established our government is wrong and undemocratic, and they should undermine it and destroy it and replace it with something else.
Hmm. Hmm.
Explain to me how that is different than the people at the Capitol on January 6th.
Which gets into understanding, Republican side anger at academia and colleges and such, which is sometimes that's what bugged me about Ezra Klein's book. He literally in his Why We're Polarized book, he devoted like a single page and basically scoffed at people being upset about things that were happening in colleges. But I think it's very important for liberals to understand colleges represent something. Like they represent you know what Republicans would see as indoctrination into these views that they oppose, right? And like if those ideas are being passed to people who will play a significant role in the country's future, it should be easy to understand, even if you disagree with it, what bugs Republicans about that kind of thing, right? Like, because it's a very influential thing, even if it's not right now that many leaders doing it. It's like it also represents what future people will think and do and all these things, right?
Right. It was amazing to me. I believe it was in 2023, but it might have been just last year. I think it was 2023. Finding an article about Tufts College that was trying a radical new experiment, which was having a class that taught conservatism. At elite colleges in the country, people should learn how to understand literally the other half of the country.
Mm-hmm.
And instead, it's a radical experiment to explain how the other side of the country thinks.
Mm-hmm.
That is a wild thing to say.
Mm-hmm.
That is a wild thing to have happening in the country.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that is just that, yes, this is what Republicans are upset about.
Yeah.
It is the way that progressive ideology has migrated into every single aspect of culture. And it is only in government, mostly because of the Federalist Society and the pro life movement, that Republicans have built power. In every other place, Democrats are in control.
Right.
And that is what you're seeing pushed back against, particularly starting in 2020. You've got a whole bunch of the old labor left people, your Bernie Sanders to Trump voters, who were incredibly frustrated with identity politics, who didn't normally vote, but if they did vote, they voted Democrat. They considered themselves generally Democrats if they were pushed on it. But then they felt like the Democrats turned on them. And now they're voting for Republicans. And now I'm lumped in with them as MAGA Republican or whatever. And it is unrecognizable to me as a traditional conservative.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think it's important to understand too the feeling that Republicans have of being culturally dominated helps explain support for someone as aggressive and um, someone like Trump who engages the way he does. I think feeling like we are the underdogs, and I read about this in book my books about polarization, where I think it's very important to understand if you feel like you're the underdog and you feel like academia and entertainment industry and news industry is all aligned against you and treats you like you're some alien contemptuous group, then you can be more supportive of more aggressive approaches like somebody like Trump embodies, right?
Yeah,
Uh,
I
yeah,
don't think it's right. I think authoritarianism is bad from both sides of the aisle. It's why I find myself more politically homeless at this moment in time than probably any other time in my entire life.
right,
Um,
right.
but that is how people feel.
Right. It's how
Um,
it helps explain why things happen, and I think we more people should be curious why things happen the way they do, and not just filter through the worst case interpretation of like it's happening this way because they're bad and they are malicious and they have the worst impulses. And but that's what these conflict leads more of us to do is filter for those worst case interpretations as opposed to understanding like, oh, I do understand why they're okay with this, or why they, why they vote for X, Y, Z, why they're okay with X, Y, Z. The
yeah.
curiosity is important, but so few people, fewer and fewer people become curious, right?
And I think
Yeah,
this goes directly to the kind of the final thing that I want to touch on, if you're okay with that, if you've still got a little
sure,
time.
yeah,
This end part that you mentioned, the tendency to speak in ways that make things seem normal and less chaotic than they are. Um,
yeah. And I can set that up a little bit. I often see it's something in the polarization space and bridge building space specifically because I often feel like there can be a tendency to understand each other, which can kind of come across or even actually be kind of like this feeling like we're trying to normalize everything, or it's like everything's okay. Let's try to understand each other. But I think it is important to see even while we're trying to understand each other, to see that polarization, toxic conflict does distort and derange the way we think, right? Like it leads to more team-based thinking. It leads to more authoritarian behaviors and people justifying things, bad things on their side. So it's kind of a tough line to thread when you're talking about trying to resolve polarization and toxic conflict, because it's like you do want to understand each other while also seeing that toxic conflict has a way of making us behave in worse ways, right? And both of I think we can thread that line. It's like because to resolve it requires us to try to understand each other more, even as our derangement leads us to instinctually be like, I don't want to resolve this, they're just bad, right? But I think it's kind of threading that needle is important to me. But yeah, go ahead and say if you want to say something about that.
Yeah, so this is where I think I always find myself at an Alexander Solzhenitsyn quote. And apologies if I completely butchered that last name. Um, I have only read the name. I am doing a homeschool thing, and that I've never heard anyone else say his name.
Yeah, I don't know
Um,
it myself. Yeah.
but he wrote in the Gulag Archipelago, which is about Soviet slaughter, basically. The line separating good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties either, but right through every human heart. And even within hearts overwhelmed by evil, one small bridgehead of good is retained. Even in the best of all hearts, there remains an uprooted small corner of evil. He
Mm-hmm.
has another quote in the same book: if only it were all so simple. If only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were necessary only to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. The line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. And who is willing to destroy a piece of his own heart?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, More and more and more in an era where so many people are willing to exercise authoritarianism against people that they see as bad and evil, I see the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Um, People do really, really horrendous things, promote and advocate for incredibly bad things with the best of intentions. I have had people tell me that the Uyghur Muslims deserved their genocide because they wouldn't give up their religion, which started with a conversation about how, wouldn't the world just be so much better if we all could understand each other and we didn't have things that got in the way and polarized us like religion? This is motivated by good, motivated by the idea that it would really be nice if we could all get along. And
Yeah.
therefore, the genocide of Uyghur Muslims is okay because they could have just given up their religion, and that would have then we would have all been able then they would have all been able to get along.
Yeah, yeah, well, yeah, and I see those. I see these kinds of messages regularly in the polarization space because I see messages from the public and some people who will be like, "Why can't we reduce these toxic divides? It's all the fault of these evil people over here." Like it's like you're behaving toxically, but you want to reduce. That it can be hard to understand that, but yeah, it is true. People's good intentions can lead them to reaching for very bad ways of thinking. Yeah.
Just over the weekend, I had a guy tell me straight up that he supported the Houthis. Why did he support the Houthis? Well, because he really believes that the Israelis are just out there murdering children, and the Houthis are trying to stop them from murdering children. And whoever is fighting against the wanton murder of children, they are doing something that is good. Again, the road to utter hell is paved with good intentions.
Yeah.
People want to do things that they think are righteous, but the justification of self-righteousness leads to extremely dark places for
Mm-hmm.
all of the people that you condemn as unrighteous.
Mm-hmm.
This is a lesson of Christianity. I'm a Christian, so it always has resonated with me. But it is also the libertarian message of self transformation, of individualism, of individual accountability, and of the belief that we are all self interested, that we are not oriented toward just doing good things for other people, but that we are oriented toward doing things on our own self-interest. And we are oriented toward justifying those things as being good.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We have to transform ourselves. We cannot transform others for them. When we seek to transform others for them, it's not really for them. It is for us.
Mm-hmm.
It is for us to feel good about ourselves. It is for our own benefit to accomplish some good outcome.
Mm-hmm.
But that road leads to hell.
Mm-hmm.
That road leads to some really, really, really dark policy places where we do not want to go as Americans.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the degree to which people have started to believe that we can just punish the evil people in society, and there are evil people, there are evil automatons that are trying to destroy the country, that is the darkest place and also a deeply inaccurate place for us to go.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it is an example of, with the best of intentions, doing extraordinarily horrendous things.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, this has been great. Elizabeth, if people wanted to follow what you do, is there a place they can follow your work? Or
They can. I have a Substack. It is understandingpolitics.substack.com. And
Great.
also they can find me at Braver Angels, where I run the Braver Politics program.
That was a talk with Elizabeth Dahl, who works, as I do, on reducing toxic political polarization. She is the director of Braver Politics at the organization Braver Angels. If you liked this talk, you might like a previous episode of mine where I talk about the myth of left and right. The idea that the concept of the left-right spectrum is an illusion, that there is no such thing as an overarching, quote, left or a, quote, right, that there is no overarching liberalism or conservatism, and that the promotion of this illusion serves to divide us further by promoting an idea that we're in the midst of some large battle between two ideological forces, when in reality we're just mainly arguing over a bunch of separate issues. I'm Zach Elwood. If you'd like to learn more about my work on polarization and maybe buy one of my books on the topic, go to American-Anger. If you're skeptical about some of what I've said about polarization, I think you should check out my books. You may look back one day and wished you'd learned more about toxic polarization and done more to help with this problem. If you don't want to buy them, I'm happy to give you a free ebook or maybe even a paperback if you send me a message. This has been the People Who Read People podcast with me, Zach Elwood. You can learn more about it at behavior-podcast.com. Thanks for listening. Music by Small Skies.